Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me today. It's a very fitting time because today is actually the first day of Salt Awareness Week, which is our flagship campaign that we run every year. And this year it's centered around the theme, Salt It Out. So hopefully I can move my slides. There we go. So now salt reduction may not always sound like it's the most exciting topic in public health, but it is one of the most impactful, and we can see that through the evidence. But because excess salt intake remains one of the leading drivers of high blood pressure worldwide, and high blood pressure is the second biggest risk factor for death globally after smoking. Now, we all know the damaging effects that smoking has on our health, but very few of us, in terms of the public, really know the impacts that having too much salt has on our overall health. And what's striking is that it's also one of the simplest and most cost-effective prevention strategies that we have at our disposal. There are no new drugs that we need to develop. There's no expensive technology that we need to work with, and there's no complicated intervention. It's just simply helping populations consume less salt over time. But despite decades of evidence and lots of, public, or not public, but health professional consensus around reducing salt, progress globally really has stalled. So I've got here in the graph on the right, we've got the gold standard measurement for assessing population salt intakes, which is 24-hour urinary sodiums. It doesn't get done very often, so I've just got here a few examples of different countries from measurements taken since 2014. But you can see that across the world, no matter what part we're all in, we're all exceeding the World Health Organization's recommended limit of no more than 5 grams of salt a day. And the WHO, they set this target to reduce salt intake by about 30%. But as you can see here, most countries remain off track, and average intakes are still well above the recommended limit there. So salt awareness this week is really about creating this moment, a moment for public awareness, for conversations between ourselves as health professionals and with our patients, but more importantly, it's for renewed policy attention, because it's really a collective effort for all of us to make this the success that it should be. It's really not an individual issue that we should be kind of pushing on our patients. It's a food systems issue altogether. Now, I'll just touch briefly on the clinical relevance, because many of you may already be aware of this, and Dr. De Vries likely will talk about it in more detail. But excess dietary salt increases our blood volume and raises our blood pressure, which over time accelerates that vascular damage. Importantly, the relationship between salt intake and cardiovascular risk is progressive. So there's no obvious safe threshold where that risk suddenly disappears. It's important that these benefits are seen it's important to note that these benefits are seen even with the most modest of reductions. And, it's never too soon to start reducing our salt intake or start thinking about our blood pressure. Often we might think of it as a symptom or a risk factor that for older generations, you don't really think about, people in their 20s, for example, don't really think about their blood pressure, but that's not to say that they shouldn't be really. And you don't necessarily need dramatic dietary changes as well to see these improvements in our blood pressure. So we wouldn't be suggesting to completely cut out salt, for example, in our diets. It's just these small little adjustments and tweaks that will have significant impacts on our overall cardiovascular health. And that's why salt reduction is relevant, not just for the patients that are already diagnosed with high blood pressure, but really across the whole population. And that's why it's important that we frame this as clinicians or as health professionals, because often these salt conversations do happen quite late on in the patient's life, once that blood pressure is already elevated. But it's important that we recognize that prevention can start much earlier than that. So where does salt really come from? I suppose it would depend on what part of the world you're at. But one of the biggest misconceptions about salt is that it's only coming from us as individuals when we add salt to our own foods. But the reality is that in many countries around the world, I'm based here in the UK. It's definitely true for us. Probably most of Western society, about 75 to 80% of the salt that we consume is already added to the foods before we even buy it. and it's not necessarily the kind of obvious salty culprits. There are, it's added to pretty much everything. It's even added to cakes and biscuits. One of the biggest contributors of salt to our diets here in the UK and most countries in Europe is actually bread. And bread doesn't necessarily taste especially salty, but because we eat it in relatively large volumes, probably continuously throughout the day, whether you're having toast for breakfast or a sandwich at lunchtime, because we eat it at such large amounts consistently and throughout the whole week, it very much quickly adds up and becomes a big source of salt for most of our diets. But it's also in things like cheese and sauces, processed meats, takeaway foods. So eating out, it's a here in the UK at least, it's a growing contributor of salt to population diets. So even highly motivated individuals would struggle to reduce their salt intake, even if they were somebody like myself who knows about the levels of salt that I should be having. It can be quite a struggle unless I was to make everything from scratch myself, which in this society, this day and age, is quite difficult to do because we all live busy lives. So even the most highly motivated individuals would struggle with this. So I think it's really important that we as health professionals, we talk about salt, not just it being an individual responsibility, but a kind of collective responsibility in talking about the food environment that we're in. As it's a food environment, really, a food environment issue, really, to help reduce that stigma and that blame on the individual themselves. So that's really why, as well, that education alone will never be enough to solve our salty problems. We do, of course, need individual awareness, but we also need food reformulation. So we need food businesses to change the recipes of the foods, the everyday food products that we're buying, so that it does contain less salt. We need better labeling standards internationally, better procurement standards, so the foods that's being provided in schools or in hospitals, and just generally overall healthier food environments. So what can health professionals, what can we as health professionals tell our patients or our clients? The good news is that even very brief conversations can be effective. No conversation around salt would be, useless. Even if somebody was to be reliant on processed, convenient foods, there are lots of things that we can do to help patients make those small little tweaks to their overall diets and their health. The main thing I would often advise is to encourage patients to read their labels on food packaging. That helps to also make comparisons to similar products on that shelf. So if you're looking at bread, for example, you're always buying that one particular brand, you could always look to see whether the competitor brands have slightly less salt in them. Even if it has 10% less salt, over time that will very quickly add up and help. And here in the UK, we have something, we have front of pack color coded, kind of like traffic light labels, similar to Nutri-Score, but it has specific colors for nutrients specifically. So saturated fats, sugars, and salt as well. And it has a kind of threshold. So with those traffic light colors, it suggests that anything more than 1.5 grams of salt per 100 grams would be considered a high salt food product. And anything that has less than 0.3 grams of salt would be considered a low product. So that's something that perhaps you could suggest or talk through with your patients. Secondly, I would recommend that we talk about swaps, focusing on swaps rather than restrictions. So patients would often hear about not eating this or completely cutting this out and stuff, and that can feel quite restrictive for them and probably put them off before they've even started. But they can still eat those same foods that they love, but it's just about making little swaps or adjustments. So you can maybe identify one or two regular high salt foods that they might be eating in their diets, and then talk through, what alternative swaps that could be. So like I mentioned, a different brand of bread, or if they have a lot of processed meats, we could talk about maybe cutting things back a little bit. My mother, for example, when I first started working at Action on Salt, she used to always add salt and stock to her rice dishes. Without realizing that stock cubes themselves had a very high, at least here in the UK, has a very high amount of salt in them. So I just talked about maybe swap it, using one or the other, so either the salt or the stock, or you can maybe cut the stock cube in half. These are things that she hadn't considered before, and it significantly made a difference to the meals that she was making. And these small tweaks, what's also important is somebody who does like to cook a lot at home, telling them to cut out the salt in their cooking might be quite an impossible or too big of a task for them. And we're not suggesting that they completely stop adding salt, but just making very small reductions. So if they would normally add a teaspoon of salt or a whole stock cube to their rice, they could just use slightly less, and their taste buds would adjust very quickly. Thirdly, I'd like to suggest about eating out. So I mentioned here in the UK, we're eating out a lot more, and that's contributing quite a lot to population's overall salt content, to population salt in their diet. Because eating out, the foods in restaurants and stuff do typically tend to be high in salt, and the nutrition information as well also isn't very, very accessible to many as well. So there are some tweaks or suggestions that you could tell your patients, for example, asking for sauces to be put on the side, or if you're having a salad, the salad dressing could be on the side, and then the patient could, or the person could choose how much dressing they want to add to their food. You could also ask the waiter for less salt when you're requesting whichever kind of meal. A lot of the time, if it's made from scratch, that should be doable for the for the chefs. I'd also briefly mention as well the use of lower sodium salt substitutes. This is growing in momentum, I would say, around the world, and the World Health Organization themselves now support this as a tool for reducing population salt intakes. It has a double benefit because it not only reduces the sodium in salt, which is what's raising our blood pressure, but it also increases our potassium, which helps to reduce blood pressure as well. There are obviously some caveats around the use of low sodium salts and those patients with chronic kidney disease, but you'd be best placed to talk about that with the patient if they have any concerns, or if they do have any other underlying health conditions that might mean that they shouldn't use low sodium salts. But if they don't have those issues, then that's also an alternative, especially if they cook a lot at home. So in terms of the bigger picture, individual behaviours, of course, does matter, and we as health professionals, we can help provide tools to help patients and individuals to reduce the salt content themselves directly, but we alone cannot solve that. Through individual responsibility alone cannot solve the issue, because it's the food environment around us, with the majority of the salt already in the foods that we buy, and it's readily accessible, readily available. They often tend to be cheaper in price as well, and they're heavily marketed, on TV, online, etc. It's really the food environment that sets the default as to us choosing these having this high salt diet. And where we've seen the biggest improvements globally is where population level policies support healthier choices. So this would include things like reformulation targets, which is directed to food businesses, clearer front of pack labeling, procurement standards, so that the standards to set what gets served in hospitals and schools, etc. Marketing restrictions as well, so making less healthy foods less accessible or appealing to the general audience, and also accountability mechanisms as well. So in the UK, for example, in the early 2000s, we had a relatively successful salt reduction program, even though it was voluntary. There was very strong monitoring mechanisms there in place, and it meant that we had it led to meaningful reductions in population salt intake. And within the same period of time, we were able to see the success that had in terms of prevention. So there was a number of foods that had reduced the salt content in them. And within the same period of time, we were able to see reductions in population blood pressure population salt intakes, reductions in population blood pressure, and also a reduced mortality rates from ischemic heart disease and stroke. And it saved millions of pounds on our National Health Service as well, because you had fewer people suffering from heart attacks and strokes, and it was costing the government a lot less money to have to deal with these sick individuals. So that was a real example of success. But once the momentum was weakened, and once we had a change in government and a change in kind of policy priorities, that progress has largely stalled. And unfortunately, we don't have that same level of success. But I think we as health professionals, we have a really incredibly important role here beyond just how we speak to our patients. By raising salt routinely, by raising the subject of salt routinely with our patients and our colleagues as well, but going beyond that, also supporting evidence-based public health policies, engaging with professional health bodies that you might have in your country, or campaigns like this week's Salt Awareness Week. We as clinicians and health professionals can help shift that social norm, really, because salt reduction isn't just a nutrition issue; it's a cardiovascular issue. It's a kidney health issue, and it's also a health inequalities issues. We've seen here in the UK, but also internationally, that those from more vulnerable groups and from more deprived groups in society, they have these higher levels of salt, and they are more vulnerable to the health consequences of such. So I'll just quickly finish off by saying that salt reduction does remain one of the simplest, most cost-effective and achievable opportunities that we have to improve public health, and that we as individuals, of course, do have a role to play, but meaningful progress requires collective action from us as individuals, health professionals, throughout healthcare, government, industry, and public health. Thank you very much.